The rain was pouring so hard that night it felt like the sky itself had given up on holding back its grief, and as Daniel rushed across the dimly lit street clutching a bag of groceries in one hand and his daughter's tiny pink umbrella in the other, he had no idea that within the next few minutes his entire life was about to change forever. Daniel had learned long ago that life did not wait for anyone to be ready, it simply kept moving forward with or without mercy, and ever since his wife passed away 3 years ago, leaving him alone with their 6-year-old daughter Lily, he had been running on nothing but love, exhaustion, and quiet determination. He worked 2 jobs, one as a delivery driver during the day and another cleaning offices at night, just to keep a small roof over their heads and food on the table, and even then there were nights when he skipped meals so Lily would never have to know what hunger felt like. That evening was supposed to be like any other, just another tired walk home through the rain, just another silent prayer that tomorrow might be a little easier. But fate had other plans. As Daniel reached the intersection, he noticed a sleek black car stalled in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly against the storm, and at first he thought nothing of it because cars broke down all the time, but then he heard it, a faint desperate cry barely audible over the thunder. Without thinking he rushed closer and peered through the fogged-up window, and what he saw made his heart stop. Inside the car was a young girl no older than 8, strapped into a specialized wheelchair, her face pale, her small hands trembling as she struggled to breathe while an oxygen mask hung loosely at her side. There was no adult in sight, no driver, no parent, just the child alone in the storm. Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. He dropped his groceries onto the wet pavement, yanked the car door open, and gently knelt beside her, trying to stay calm even as panic surged through him. "It's okay, sweetheart, I'm here now," he said softly as he adjusted the oxygen mask back onto her face, his hands shaking but steady enough to help. The girl's eyes met his, filled with fear and something else, something deeper, like she had already known too much pain for someone so young. Her breathing was uneven and labored, and Daniel realized this was no simple situation. She needed help, and she needed it fast. He looked around frantically and spotted a medical emergency kit on the back seat, likely left by whoever had been with her but had somehow disappeared. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed it and carefully followed the instructions inside, doing everything he could remember from a basic first aid course he had taken years ago, praying silently that it would be enough. Minutes felt like hours as the rain continued to fall, but slowly her breathing began to stabilize and the tight grip she had on his arm loosened just enough for him to breathe again. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Just then headlights cut through the storm and a black SUV pulled up abruptly beside them. A man in an expensive suit jumped out, his face pale with terror. "Emily!" he shouted, rushing toward the car. The girl's eyes lit up slightly and Daniel stepped back as the man pulled her into a careful embrace, relief washing over his face. "What happened?" the man asked, his voice trembling. Daniel explained quickly how he found her and what he had done, and for a moment the man just stared at him as if trying to process everything. Then, without warning, his composure broke and tears filled his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You saved my daughter." Daniel shrugged awkwardly, not knowing what to say. He had never been good with gratitude or attention. He simply did what anyone would have done. The man introduced himself as Victor, a successful businessman who had stepped away for just a few minutes to get help when his car stalled, never imagining something could go wrong so quickly. An ambulance arrived soon after and Emily was taken to the hospital while Victor insisted that Daniel come along. At first Daniel refused, thinking of Lily waiting at home, but when Victor offered to send someone to safely bring her to the hospital, Daniel finally agreed. That night at the hospital, Daniel stayed until he knew Emily was stable, and only then did he quietly slip away, not wanting recognition or reward, just grateful that the little girl was safe. He assumed that would be the end of it, just another moment in life that came and went like everything else. But the next morning proved him wrong. As Daniel prepared to leave for work, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Victor standing there, accompanied by 2 well-dressed assistants, and for a moment Daniel wondered if he had the wrong address, but Victor smiled warmly and said, "I told you I would find you." Daniel invited him in, embarrassed by the small cramped apartment, but Victor showed no judgment, only quiet observation. "Lily peeked out from behind her father, curious, and Victor knelt down to greet her with a gentle smile. "You must be Lily," he said. "Your dad is a hero." Lily's eyes widened with pride, and she hugged Daniel's leg tightly. Victor stood up and turned back to Daniel, his expression serious. "Now I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said, "but I would like to try." Daniel shook his head quickly. "There's no need, I was just doing what anyone would do." Victor smiled slightly. "Not everyone would have stopped in that storm. Not everyone would have known what to do. Not everyone would have cared enough." He paused, then added, "I visited many people this morning, doctors, drivers, security staff, but no one had answers. No one knew how my daughter survived until I found you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this was going. Victor took a deep breath and continued, "I have everything: money, success, influence, but yesterday I realized how powerless I truly am when it comes to the one thing that matters most: my daughter." He looked around the small apartment again, then back at Daniel. "And I also realized something else. You may not have much in terms of money, but you have something far more valuable: heart, courage, and the kind of strength that cannot be bought." Daniel remained silent, unsure how to respond. Then Victor said something that completely changed everything. "I want to offer you a job." Daniel blinked in surprise. "A job?" Victor nodded. "I need someone I can trust, someone who will always put my daughter's well-being first. Someone like you." Daniel hesitated. He had responsibilities, bills, routines. He couldn't just walk away from everything. As if reading his thoughts, Victor added, "It will pay more than both your jobs combined, and it will allow you to spend more time with your daughter." Daniel felt his chest tighten. This was not just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. But still, he asked, "Why me?" Victor smiled. "Because yesterday, when you had nothing to gain, you gave everything." There was a long silence as Daniel looked at Lily, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. In that moment he realized this was not just about him anymore, it was about giving Lily a better life, a chance at something more than constant struggle. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I accept." From that day forward, everything began to change. Daniel started working closely with Victor, ensuring Emily's daily care and safety, and over time he formed a special bond with her. She was kind, intelligent, and incredibly strong despite her condition, and she quickly grew attached to Daniel and Lily. The two girls became inseparable, their laughter filling spaces that once felt cold and empty. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Months passed and life slowly transformed in ways Daniel could never have imagined. He moved into a better home. Lily started attending a good school, and for once there was stability. But the greatest change came from Emily herself. One evening she called Daniel into her room, her expression unusually serious. "I have something for you," she said softly. She handed him a small envelope, and inside was a letter along with documents. Daniel frowned, slightly confused, until he read the contents. It was a deed to a house fully paid in his name. He looked up at her in shock. "Emily, I can't accept this." She smiled gently. "Yes, you can." Daniel shook his head. "This is too much." Emily's eyes softened, and she said quietly, "You saved my life." He tried to interrupt, but she continued, "And not just that, you gave me something I didn't even know I was missing: family." Daniel felt his throat tighten as emotions he had kept buried for years began to surface. "You and Lily," she went on, "you made me feel normal. You made me feel loved without conditions." She paused, then added, "This is not charity, this is my way of saying thank you." Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he realized the true impact of what had happened that rainy night. He had saved a life, but in doing so he had also unknowingly changed his own. From that moment on, their lives became forever intertwined, not through obligation or debt, but through genuine love and connection. And as Daniel stood there holding the keys to a new future, he finally understood something profound. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest miracles. Sometimes helping someone else is the very thing that saves you, and sometimes, just sometimes, life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. All you have to do is be brave enough to take it. Daniel stood there for a long time, unable to move as the weight of everything settled deep within him, the envelope still trembling in his hands, while Emily watched him quietly, her eyes filled with a calm understanding far beyond her years. For a man who had spent most of his life surviving rather than living, this moment felt unreal, like something that belonged to someone else's story, not his. He finally lowered the papers and shook his head gently, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how To thank you, Emily smiled softly. You already did a long time ago. That night Daniel could not sleep. He sat by the window of his small apartment watching the city lights flicker in the distance while Lily slept peacefully beside him clutching her favorite toy, and for the first time in years his thoughts were not filled with worry about bills or exhaustion from endless work. Instead they were filled with questions, hope, and a quiet fear of losing something that felt too good to be true. Change had entered his life suddenly, and while it brought opportunity, it also brought uncertainty. The next few weeks moved quickly. Victor arranged everything just as promised. Daniel and Lily moved into the new house, a modest but beautiful place filled with warmth, sunlight, and a sense of belonging that Daniel had never experienced before. Lily ran through every room with excitement, her laughter echoing through the halls as if she was trying to fill every corner with joy, and Daniel watched her with a smile that carried both happiness and disbelief. "This is ours?" she asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. Daniel knelt down and nodded. "Yes, it is." She threw her arms around him, and in that moment every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every struggle felt worth it. But life was not done testing them yet. A few months into his new role, Daniel began to notice subtle changes in Victor. The confident, composed businessman who once seemed unshakable now carried a quiet heaviness in his eyes. He worked longer hours, took more calls, and often seemed lost in thought. One evening Daniel found him sitting alone in his office staring at a file, his expression tense. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked gently. Victor sighed and leaned back in his chair. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to speak, but then he said something that caught Daniel off guard. He might lose everything. Daniel frowned, not understanding what he meant. Victor explained that his company was facing a serious financial crisis. A deal that he had invested heavily in had collapsed, leaving him vulnerable to massive losses. Investors were pulling out, competitors were circling, and the pressure was mounting. Daniel listened quietly. He was not a businessman, he did not understand the complexities of high-level deals, but he understood something else. He understood fear, responsibility, and the weight of having people depend on you. "What about Emily?" Daniel asked. Victor's expression softened. "She doesn't know. And I want to keep it that way." Daniel nodded, but deep down he knew things like this rarely stayed hidden for long. Over the next few weeks the tension grew. Victor became more distant, and the once vibrant home began to feel heavier, as if something invisible was pressing down on everyone. Emily noticed it too. One afternoon she asked Daniel, "Is my dad going to be okay?" Daniel hesitated before answering. He forced a reassuring smile. "He will be." But Emily looked at him carefully, as if trying to read the truth behind his words. That night Daniel made a decision. He may not have had money or influence, but he had something that had carried him through the hardest times of his life: resilience and the ability to keep going when everything seemed lost. The next morning he walked into Victor's office with a quiet determination. "Let me help you." Victor looked at him surprised. "You already do." Daniel shook his head. "No, I mean really help." Victor smiled faintly. "Daniel, this is not something you can fix." Daniel met his gaze. "Maybe not, but I know what it feels like to be backed into a corner too. Feel like everything is slipping away." He stepped closer, his voice steady. "You taught me something when you gave me this chance. You believed in me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn to believe in you." Victor remained silent for a moment, then asked, "What do you have in mind?" Daniel took a deep breath. He didn't have a perfect plan, but he had an idea. Over the years of working multiple jobs he had met many people: small business owners, delivery clients, office workers, people who had trusted him, respected him, and relied on him. "What if we start small?" he said. "What if instead of focusing on the big deal that failed, we rebuild from the ground up?" Victor listened carefully as Daniel explained his idea: to shift focus towards smaller, stable ventures, rebuilding trust with local partners, strengthening the foundation rather than chasing risky expansion. It was not a glamorous plan, it was not something that would impress investors overnight, but it was practical, honest, and grounded in something Victor had almost forgotten: reality. At first Victor was hesitant, but as days passed and options became limited he decided to try. What followed was not easy. There were setbacks, doubts, and moments when it seemed like nothing would work, but slowly things began to change. Small deals turned into steady income, partnerships began to form, trust started to rebuild, and through it all Daniel remained by his side, not as an employee but as a constant support, a reminder that strength was not about never falling but about always Getting back up months later, the company stabilized. It was not as powerful as it once was, but it was alive, growing, and most importantly secure. One evening, Victor stood in the living room watching Emily and Lily play together, their laughter filling the space just like before. He turned to Daniel, his expression filled with something deeper than gratitude. "You didn't just save my daughter that night." Daniel looked at him confused. "You saved me too." Daniel smiled slightly. "Maybe we just helped each other." Victor nodded. "Maybe that's what family does." From that moment on, the bond between them became unbreakable, not defined by wealth or status but by shared struggles, trust, and the understanding that life's greatest gifts often come from the most unexpected moments. Years passed, and the story of that rainy night became something they would talk about often, not as a moment of rescue but as the beginning of something far greater, a second chance, a new beginning, a life rebuilt not on money or success but on kindness, courage, and the simple act of caring for another human being. And as Daniel stood one evening watching the sunset from the porch of his home with Lily by his side and the sound of Emily's laughter in the background, he realized something he had spent years searching for without even knowing. He was no longer just surviving, he was finally living. And it all began with a single choice in the rain: to stop, to care, to help, because sometimes the smallest moments carry the power to change everything. Time moved forward as it always does, quietly, steadily, without asking permission, and yet for Daniel every passing day now carried a sense of purpose he had never known before. Mornings were no longer rushed chaos filled with exhaustion but gentle beginnings filled with laughter. Lily would sit at the breakfast table telling stories about school while Emily joined through video calls or sometimes in person, her presence brightening the entire room. The house that once felt too big for just two people now felt alive, filled with warmth, voices, and something deeper, something that could not be bought or built overnight, belonging. But even in a life that had finally found its rhythm, challenges never truly disappear, they simply change their shape. One evening as Daniel was preparing dinner, his phone rang. It was the hospital. His heart dropped instantly. When he arrived, he found Victor standing outside Emily's room, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly as if he was holding himself together by force. "Alone, what happened?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Victor exhaled slowly. "Her condition has worsened." The words felt heavy, like they carried more than just meaning. They carried fear, memories, and the fragile reality that no matter how much life had improved, some battles were far from over. The doctors explained that Emily's condition required a complex treatment, one that was not only risky but also uncertain. It offered hope but no guarantees. Daniel watched Victor as he listened. Every word seemed to cut deeper than the last. For a man who had faced financial collapse and rebuilt everything, this was different. This was something money could not control. Later that night, Daniel sat beside Emily. She looked smaller somehow, but her eyes were still strong, still filled with that quiet courage. "Are you scared?" he asked gently. She smiled faintly. "A little." He nodded. "That's okay." She looked at him for a moment before asking something that broke his heart in ways he could not explain. "If something happens to me, will you take care of my dad?" Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening as he tried to hold his composure. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said softly, but she didn't look convinced. "Promise me," she whispered. He reached for her hand and held it carefully as if it were something fragile and precious. "I promise." In that moment the roles felt reversed, the child seeking reassurance not for herself but for the person she loved most. The surgery was scheduled a few days later, and those days felt longer than any Daniel had ever experienced. Lily noticed the tension. She stayed close to him, often hugging him without saying anything, as if she understood that sometimes words were not enough. On the morning of the surgery, the hospital was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that made every thought louder. Victor stood beside Emily as they prepared to take her in, his composure gone, completely replaced by raw emotion. "I'll be right here," he told her, his voice breaking. Emily nodded and then looked at Daniel and "Lily, don't forget me," she said softly. Lily stepped forward quickly and hugged her tightly. "We never will." As the doors closed behind her, time seemed to stop. Hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into something unbearable. Daniel sat beside Victor, neither of them speaking much, because there was nothing to say that could make the waiting easier. At some point Victor finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life building things. Businesses, success, reputation, but none of it Matters right now. Daniel looked at him quietly. I would give everything just to know she will be okay. Victor continued. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the things we can't control are the ones that teach us the most about what truly matters. Victor nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the doors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgeon walked out. Both men stood immediately, their hearts pounding. The doctor removed his mask, and for a brief moment his expression revealed nothing. And then he smiled. The surgery was successful. Relief crashed over them like a wave too strong to stand against. Victor closed his eyes as tears finally fell freely, no longer held back by strength or pride. Daniel let out a breath. He didn't realize he had been holding his entire body, relaxing for the first time in days. When they were finally allowed to see her, Emily was asleep but stable, her small chest rising and falling steadily. Victor sat beside her, holding her hand as if letting go was no longer an option. Days turned into weeks, and slowly Emily began to recover. Each small improvement felt like a victory, each smile a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. But something had changed, not just in Emily but in all of them. They no longer took time for granted. They no longer waited for the right moment to say what mattered. One evening, as they all sat together in the living room, Emily looked at Daniel and said something that stayed with him forever. "You didn't just save my life twice." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean twice?" She smiled. "The first time was in the car." She paused, then added, "The second time was when you stayed." The words were simple, but their meaning ran deep. Daniel realized then that sometimes saving someone is not about a single moment of action but about the choice to remain, to support, to care, even when things become difficult. Years later, life continued to evolve. Emily grew stronger, her health improving beyond what anyone had expected. Victor's business found its footing again, but this time it was different. It was no longer driven by ambition alone but by purpose. Daniel eventually started his own small company with Victor's support, something he had never imagined possible in his old life. Lily grew into a confident, kind young girl, carrying the lessons of love and resilience that had shaped her childhood, and through it all they remained together, not bound by circumstance but by something far more powerful: choice. They chose each other every day, through good moments and difficult ones, through uncertainty and growth. And as Daniel looked back on everything, the struggles, the pain, the unexpected turns, he understood something clearly. Life does not change in a single moment, it changes in the choices we make within those moments. A decision to help a stranger, a decision to stay when things get hard, a decision to love without expecting anything in return. Those are the moments that shape everything, and sometimes those moments begin in the most ordinary way, on a rainy night with a single choice to care.